Before we dig into today's episode, I want to take a moment and talk about something close to my home, my journey into podcasting. Dog with a Bone is my first season, and I am beyond grateful to have teamed up with James Basinger and Sasquatch Production. If you're into deep dives, real boots on the ground investigations, and the kind of storytelling that leaves no stone unturned, you'll want to check out James's own podcast, Hide and Seek. He's currently working on season 4, but if you haven't yet, I highly recommend starting with season 1 through 3. They're all out now. And welcome back to Dog with a Bone podcast. This is episode 5, 6 minutes. Please make sure to like and follow us on Dog with a Bone Facebook or Instagram page to join in on the investigation as we move through the season. I would love to hear your thoughts on the episodes previously and the ones to come. You can also subscribe to Dog with a Bone podcast on Spotify or wherever you listen so you don't miss an episode. All names mentioned in the podcast are innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. In the previous episode, we heard from Nickel and what his thoughts were on the burglary and why Bernie's death was ruled a suicide. We learned the assumptions Dr. MacGyver made in regards to the manner of death that could have resulted in someone or someone's getting away with murder. So, when and how did the manner of death change from a suicide to a homicide? I believe in every case there are unsung heroes. In Bernie's case, this would be the funeral director who embalmed Bernie and raised the flag to the family immediately upon seeing Bernie. I was able to get him on the phone, and I could not wait to thank him for being a good person and doing the right thing. He prefers his name not to be mentioned, but agreed for me to refer to him as the funeral director. This is what he remembers upon seeing Bernie's body.
I had no questions when I looked at him. I said, I was told that they found him with a bag around his neck and tape around it. And I knew that was bull, because who in the heck's disciplined enough to commit suicide by putting a bag around their head and suffocating themselves? That's so crazy. There's no reason why they should not have ordered an immediate autopsy. I mean, that would be a coroner's case anywhere. But I obviously thought for sure there's some questionable things that went on with the police there. And I know it was in Marysville.
Yes.
I had my questions from the start. I said, he's got bruises on his hands and his head. And I thought I remembered, of course, Doc Davis just died. I thought I remembered him saying that, like hematomas and stuff like that. So, yeah, that was a fishy situation from the start. So I hope that he's the one that did it.
By the time you got him, they didn't do a coroner report. There was no investigation.
I didn't know anything about it. When I found out what had happened, that he committed suicide, I thought that's a joke. Who would not order an autopsy in that case? I mean, that would protect them too. But Obviously there was a reason why they didn't want to do an autopsy. So. Right.
And do you remember, did he have defensive wounds on his arms and knuckles?
I think he had them on his hands. I mean, it's been 30 years. But I remember him having marks on him and stuff on his hands.
The funeral director was spot on. Based on the autopsy report from Dr. Davis, we know that Bernie was struck so hard in the head it resulted in his brain bleeding in 4 different places. Bernie's official cause of death was asphyxiation. He would have eventually died from the brain bleed, but because the bag was placed over his head by someone, this was the cause of death. Bernie had been struck so hard that he would have been knocked unconscious. So the question is, How did Sergeant Glenn Nickel, Chief Rick Coots, Dr. MacGyver all miss these obvious signs? I mean, the funeral director noticed, but those in charge of homicide investigations didn't? What type of investigation did Sergeant Nickel conduct to arrive at a suicide ruling? Besides referencing a TV show, of course. This is Paula and Steve telling me what Nickel instructed them to do the day after Bernie was found.
He told us to go in because somebody broke in and stole the safe. They could come back in and get his stereo and stuff like that. He told us to go in and get the stuff out of there.
Which it should be a crime scene.
We destroyed the crime scene. We didn't want anybody to violate John's house. We wanted to go ahead and get all of his things.
That just right there, too, frustrates me because they can say the scene is contaminated. You're supposed to treat all suicides like a homicide until proven otherwise. Nobody should have been in that home. Nobody. They needed to process that scene and that house like it was a murder until otherwise proven. Why would you have people even step foot in that house?
Yeah.
Yep, and we went in there and hauled stuff out.
As you already heard, I was shocked at discovering how negligent Marysville PD were in this case. Then to find out they had a homicide, but the scene had already been destroyed. What I find really disturbing is if the funeral director hadn't spoken up, someone would have gotten away with murder. What really keeps me up at night is thinking about just how many other deaths in Marysville under the administration of Chief Coots were deemed suicides without any other investigations or autopsy. Once the autopsy on Bernie came back with the manner of death changed to homicide, Chief Rick Coots decided he wanted a second opinion and hired a coroner. What is frustrating is Dr. MacGyver told Bernie's dad when he was questioning the suicide ruling that if he wanted an autopsy, well, he would just have to pay for one himself. They were extremely expensive. But now that an autopsy was done and was determined to be a homicide, Marysville offered to pay for another county to do one. I guess they're not so expensive anymore. Jefferson County declined to get involved, but Harris County did accept the offer and confirmed Dr. Davis's findings of a homicide. Based on this information, I believe the motive for the murder is coming into focus. I want to now review the timeline and see if it is coming into focus for you all as well. This timeline is based on the police reports and individuals I have spoken to who were around Bernie that night. This will give us the window of when Bernie was murdered. Between 11 and 11:30 p.m. on December 10th, John and Alan make their first attempt at stealing Bernie's safe. Bernie is at Steffen's bar with Eric, Bo, and Jackie. 11:40 to 11:50, John and Alan head back to the hideaway bar to get the additional help, Alan's brother Ray. According to Ray, John and Alan did not spend long in the bar before they left and returned to Bernie's house. The hideaway bar was only 5 minutes away. 11:50 to midnight, Bernie and Eric leave Steffen's to return to do a line of coke back at Bernie's using Nick's truck. At 12:02 a.m. on December 11th, Bernie calls the cops. At 12:05, according to the police report, Officer Basinger arrives on the scene. No, not our James Basinger, another Basinger. Officer Basinger proceeds to call Sergeant Glenn Nickel to the scene, given Bernie was someone Marysville Police Department had been watching and had been wanting to get for drug trafficking. 11:50 to 12:05, John, Alan, and Ray return to Bernie's house for the second attempt to steal the safe. But the cops are there, so they return to the hideaway for the rest of the night. Between midnight and 12:15, Jackie sends Bo to Bernie's to find out what is taking Eric and Bernie so long. Bo goes inside where Bernie and the cops are in the kitchen. Bo does not recall the couch being flipped over or seeing the police push Eric as Jackie remembered. Bo does remember being told that Eric needed to leave the house and Bernie needed to stay. So Bo drives Eric back to Steffen's. Bo also remembers when they drove back to Steffens, Jackie was already waiting outside for them. They returned and everything was dark and closed up. Bernie was not answering the door. However, this is not what Jackie remembers. Jackie remembers Bo and Eric coming into Steffens as Nick had just returned from work at Honda and his truck was still not back. Bo and Eric tell Jackie what happened, and then the three of them head over after the bar closes between 2 and 2:30 a.m. In Nichols' report, Nichols says that Eric left with Bo, and he left shortly after them between 2:04 and 2:15 a.m. My question is, if they were wrapping up the investigation, not arresting Bernie, why couldn't Bernie leave with Bo and Eric? Also, why make Eric leave or threaten to arrest him for interfering if you were already wrapping up yourself? So, according to Jackie and Bo, they returned and everything was wrapped up very quickly, and no sign of Bernie. Based on the police reports, we are looking at a 6-minute window when Bernie was murdered. In reviewing new records, Dr. MacGyver said that the time of death was 10 hours prior after Bernie was found the next day around noon. This puts the murder at 1:30 to 2 a.m. The police were still at the home per Nichols' own report. This would mean the killer entered and killed Bernie while the cops were there? That can't be right, or is it? When the results from the autopsy came back with the manner of death listed as homicide, the Burnside family made a decision that would ultimately not sit well with Nichol or Coots. Paula remembers an incident right after they had asked the sheriff's office to get involved.
One thing, when my dad and I was there at that house, I was there because the Channel 6 or whoever it was from Columbus was coming there to interview my dad and I. Before they got there, plane car pulled up and Nichols stormed into the living room. Glenn Nichols, the detective who had talked to, I hadn't seen since the night after the murder, the day after the murder, when we recorded him in his office. He came in there and he was so mad at me for taking the case from the police department, because John lived in Marysville and it was there, and gave it to the sheriff department because we didn't want them working on it. So mad, and I was in the middle of the living room when he walked in, and I thought, I didn't even think hostile. I was thinking friendly, and I said hello, and he got right in my face and backed me up from the middle of the living room. I was up against the wall. He was yelling and that hostile at me in the face that I just kept walking back. And after I was up against the wall, then he stormed out and left. I wish I had that on tape.
Me too.
My dad did not see that. He was back somewhere else.
And I wasn't there.
And no one saw it unless the other guy that was sitting in the car. He didn't drive. Someone else was with him. But he was that angry that he backed me up from the middle of a living room to the wall. And then stormed away. And I never spoke to him since.
Well, that says a lot.
That's a temper.
How scary would this be? I have spoken to many sources that had interactions with Nichol. They all describe him the same, a hothead and someone who should not have been a police officer. People tell me how he would become physically violent, used intimidation and fear as weapons to get what he wanted. Sounds like that's exactly what happened to Paula. The best person to talk about the investigation and the details surrounding what happened on December 11th is Glenn Nickel himself. Glenn Nickel is currently a chief of police in London, Ohio. I decided to give him a call so he could have an opportunity to respond.
Hi, sorry. Can I talk to Police Chief Nickel, please?
He's not here. Would you like a voicemail?
That would be great. Thank you so much.
Chief Glenn Nickel is not available to take your call. Please leave a message after the tone. Press the pound key to end the recording.
Hi, Chief Nickel. My name is Melissa Sandberg, and I am currently looking into the murder of John Burnside, who was murdered in December of 1993.
I followed up with yet another call and email, but unfortunately, he hasn't responded. Once the Marysville Police Department found out that the family had requested the sheriff department to take the case, Nickel was not the only one who had a few words to say about the family and the investigation. Chief Coots of Marysville made a statement to the Marysville Tribune regarding the manner of death being changed to homicide. Chief Coots states, quote, "The nature of the investigation will not change based on Cleveland's opinion. We will continue our investigation just as we have been," end quote. I find it shocking that Chief Coots considered the well-known and respected Dr. Davis, who was a pathologist and a member of the Board of Medical Forensic Science, to be just an opinion, compared to Dr. MacGyver, who was a family physician. Another county coroner reviewed the autopsy and also agreed with Dr. Davis. So, isn't it no longer an opinion, but a fact? This was a homicide. My other concern with Chief Coots' statement is he said that they will continue the investigation, quote, just as we have been, end quote. What investigation exactly? Your detective and coroner thought it was a suicide and were no longer investigating the burglary because, as Nickel said, quote, it was now a victimless crime, end quote. Coots doubles down and goes on to say, quote, I still have all the faith in the world that Sergeant Glenn Nickel can bring this case to a proper closure, end quote. Closure for who? It's been 30 years and still no justice for Bernie or his family. Since Coots said he had all the faith in the world that Nickel could bring this case to a closure, I asked Bo if Nickel or Coots interviewed her as part of the investigation, and she said they did, but then shared a very disturbing account of what happened.
I know when they took me in and interviewed me when all this stuff happened and we went into the police station, I told them what I thought. They'd keep turning off the recorder and say, nope, try again. I'd tell them what I thought. They'd turn off the recorder and they wouldn't take anything that I said because it's not what they wanted to hear.
That's pretty big.
That's pretty shitty.
That's rather scary right there. My first thought when she told me this was, am I on candid camera? You're telling me that we have detective and a chief of police turning off recorders during interviews now? What's next? The first thing I needed to do was get my hands on that cassette tape. Could we have the tape analyzed to see if the tape was stopped and restarted? I also wanted to find out if the duct tape and bag resulted in any fingerprints or DNA, and if not, could we retest these items? I contacted Agent Mason to see what the results were from the first test of the trash bag and duct tape. According to BCI, the bag and duct tape tested in 1994 yielded no fingerprints, and the items were returned to Marysville Police Department. My question is, shouldn't Bernie's fingerprints been on the bag and tape? A lack of evidence is evidence, right? As with any investigation, you run into the obstacles with a 30-year-old case. According to Marysville Police Department, a lot of the evidence in Bernie's case was destroyed due to a flood in the late 1990s. The files were kept in a storage locker that was impacted by the flood. I guess there goes our cassette tapes. But I hold out hope. But what about the trash bag and duct tape? Did those survive the flood? Maybe they were kept someplace else for future testing. One can hope. Here's Paula telling me what happened with those items. Do you recall when you met with, was it Chief Coots or Glenn Nickel, where he pulled out the duct tape out of his desk drawer and slammed it right down on his desk in front of you and your dad, and the trash bag, is that right?
Yes, it was Chief Coots.
So again, the chief of police is pulling out evidence. Now, was this evidence already went to BCI to be tested?
I was told that.
Okay.
I really wouldn't have had proof on that.
Yes, right. Because it wasn't in any kind of evidence bag. It wasn't labeled. It was just in his desk. So the listeners can understand, you're sitting there with Chief Coots, who represents Marysville. He's the chief of police. You're asking for updates on Bernie's homicide, trying to figure out what's going on. And he pulls out the duct tape that was used to tie the trash bag around Bernie's head and puts it right down in front of you both?
Yes.
What was your response? What was your dad's response?
We were both shocked, but also at that point we felt we weren't sure if BCI did get that. So since we were wanting to take the investigation away from him and give it to the sheriff, the Union County Sheriff, and then we wanted the BCI to work on it directly with us, we were shocked, but we decided we would take it with us.
Just another act from Chief Coots and Marysville PD of how your family was treated. I mean, first of all, you're talking evidence that down the road, we know this, right? Like in 15, 20 years, there's new technology, there's new things that could produce fingerprints, or you have the trash bag, you have other things that you're looking at going, okay, well, you could use that. And then all of a sudden he just pulls out of his desk drawer and was like, here you go.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah.
And you're like, that's the bag that was on my brother's head, and you're just sitting it down in front of us? Like, what was his whole demeanor when he did that?
Like, take it, go, don't waste my time. Yeah.
Well, we're wasting their time now for sure, because, I mean, that is just unbelievable. I mean, I'm still shocked at that evidence was treated that way, your family was treated that way, and clearly they have a reason to hide, because that's not how you store evidence. I don't care if it was 1993. You still are chain of custody, you have it in a bag, you keep it, not in your desk drawer. We are working with BCI, and so hopefully they have record that those items were sent to them. I really want to know that. Are you kidding me right now? According to Paula, Rick Coots pulled out the duct tape and trash bag and set it right in front of Bernie's dad and his sister. I didn't think that this case could shock me anymore until I heard that. The fact that Rick Coots took duct tape and a trash bag out of his desk drawer that were not secure in any kind of evidence bag and just slammed it down in front of the victim's dad and sister? Who does that? It was now time for me to reach out to Rick Coots, who is retired, to see if he can answer questions about Bernie's homicide, the investigation, and address these statements being made by the community on his and his department's actions. Rick was working at the time of our call, so due to the loud noises where he was at, I decided to use artificial intelligence as I felt it was really important for you to hear what he said instead of me summarizing our call. Hi, is this Mr. Coots?
Yes?
Thank you for returning my call. I'm just looking into the John Burnside murder.
It's very interesting since I've been retired for 27 years, but I was chief at the time.
So, what do you remember about the case being the chief?
It was reported as a burglary by Mr. Burnside. His safe had been stolen, and it was opened, and all his illegal drugs were taken out of the safe.
I don't think that they got anything out of the safe. They couldn't get it open.
From what I understand, now, you got to remember, this is 30 years ago, right?
I can try to help remind you on a couple of things from what I know.
Okay.
Who called it in?
He reported the theft of the drugs, I believe.
What I know is the person who tried to steal the safe, they couldn't, like it got stuck in the wheelbarrow, so they didn't take the safe.
I believe that's correct.
And then Bernie called and they found the safe. There was a guy named Eric. Are you familiar with him?
Eric?
Yes.
Name sounds familiar, but like I said, that's been over 30 years ago.
He was there that night. My question to you is, given the amount of drugs and cash that Bernie had in that safe, would it be normal for the detectives who responded to call you or call somebody to say, hey?
I was called, but I was out of town at the time. I can't remember exactly what my instructions would have been to the detective.
But wouldn't you arrest him given the size of coke and money he had?
Would it have been to arrest him?
Yes.
Not at that time. Mr. Burnside was not going anywhere. The case was being investigated not only as a burglary and a theft, but it was also being investigated as a drug case against Mr. Burnside. It would not have been truly expedient to arrest Mr. Burnside at that time. He wasn't going anywhere.
So even with the amount of drugs and cash, it was to just let him be?
No. We would have continued to investigate the case and then turned it over to the prosecutor and probably done a direct indictment of Mr. Burnside.
So I have this question. When I was looking at everything and talking to people, it looks like after your detectives left, Bernie was no longer answering the door. Everything went quiet.
I don't know what the time frame was. We weren't notified until the next morning that they couldn't contact Mr. Burnside.
So you don't recall that people were calling your office, calling your detective saying where he's at, he's not answering the door?
No.
That's my concern. I'm hoping to find out. They say they have phone records of them calling the cops, but I'm looking into that too because I want to make sure that they were calling because they're saying he's not answering the door. We can't reach him. Is he in jail?
That wasn't until, to my recollection, later on that morning.
It wasn't that night?
No.
The family had an autopsy done shortly after, right after the funeral, and the coroner deemed a homicide.
It wasn't deemed a homicide until several weeks later, and the Union County coroner at that time called it undetermined. I was presented a letter from the coroner's office, right, that stated that he still felt it was a suicide. That letter was never made public. I'm going to have to go. Okay, can I call you back later?
Absolutely. I appreciate your time. I really do. Okay, thank you so much, sir.
Okay, bye-bye.
If you could have seen my face, my mouth was wide open when he mentions a letter he received from Dr. MacGyver. You would think that Coots would be waving this letter around for all to see based on his previous statements. Why keep it quiet then? But since he mentioned a letter, let me have Paula tell you about the letter she got from Chief Coots when asking for an update on her brother's case.
It was a letter from the Marysville Police Department, their letterhead, and it was a blank sheet of stationery paper.
You mean just a blank sheet of paper?
Correct.
There was nothing else on it?
Nothing. He never wrote or typed a thing. He just mailed me a letterhead from the Marysville Police Department.
Why do you think he did that?
To let me know that he had no information, or to let me know he didn't want to give me any information.
I don't think that there's any way or any reason to send a family member who's asking for an update a blank sheet of paper on a letterhead and mail it to their house. That sounds more like a FU kind of response.
I agree. Totally heartless.
And I've actually seen the letter, and I was disgusted, first of all. But, I mean, what kind of person who is a chief of police sends a letter to a victim's family with nothing on it when asking for an update? So.
Yeah. Unbelievable. I would have never thought that would happen from a professional person at a professional office actually representing the entire police department at Marysville, Ohio.
Yeah.
So unprofessional, so heartless, so ridiculous. It would have been better to just never responded.
Right. And I think the reason why he did that was he wasn't happy with you. He wasn't happy with your dad. And that's really what I think that was the reason for his doing that.
Yeah, and he wasn't happy that we did the private autopsy.
Right.
And exposed his police department.
I tried calling Rick back a few times and texted him, but no response.
Call has been forwarded to an automated voice messaging system. Is not available. At the tone, please record your message. When you've finished recording, you may hang up or press 1 for more options.
Hi, Mr. Coots. It's Melissa again, calling you back. I know that you said you'd call me back yesterday. Am I no longer investigating the ones who broke into Bernie's house to steal the safe, but the officers who were on scene that night? Is it possible we are investigating not one crime, but two? It would be very difficult to introduce a new suspect in 6 minutes between when Nicholas said they left Bernie alive to when Jackie, Eric, and Bo returned and there were no signs of Bernie. So, how do they explain this timeline? Returning of the evidence, a lack of investigation? Well, as far as myself, the family, or the community, they haven't. I think this is because they've never been asked to explain their reports and the actions they took. Except for now, they will. On Dog with a Bone. Hi!
Hey, how you doing?
You Eric?
Yeah.
All right. I'm Melissa.
Melissa, nice to meet you.
Dog with a Bone is hosted, investigated, produced, and written by Melissa Sandberg. Additional writing by Caitlin Sandberg. Edited by Jason Sandberg. Theme music by Alex Yukich. Dog with a Bone is a Sasquatch production.